The air in the neurology conference room was calibrated to a precise 68 degrees. It was cold enough to keep the residents alert, sterile enough to discourage anything as messy as human error. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, my laser pointer steady on the projection of a complex temporal lobe mapping. I was dissecting the synaptic pathways with the same detached precision I applied to my entire life. The hospital was a grid, and I was the architect of its order. I was mid-sentence, explaining the delicate firing rates of the hippocampus, when the atmosphere shifted. The door didn't bang open. It clicked. A soft, deliberate sound that cut through my monologue like a scalpel. I looked up, annoyed at the interruption, and the words simply died in my throat. A woman stood in the doorway. She didn't apologize, and she didn't scurry to a seat in the back like a late intern terrified of my reputation. She held the doorframe for a beat longer than necessary, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on me. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a collision. She walked to the empty chair directly to my left, her movements fluid and unhurried, occupying the space with a casual authority that irritated me instantly. My department was a fortress of logic, a place where variables were controlled and outcomes were predicted. Yet here was this anomaly, dripping wet from the storm outside, disrupting the magnetic field of the room just by breathing. She sat, shaking out her dark, damp hair, and the sensory input hit me before I could process her face. The room was a vacuum of antiseptic and stale coffee until she sat down. Suddenly, the air carried a sharp, intrusive freshness, rain and ozone. She smelled like a storm breaking, heavy and charged, cutting right through the sterilized atmosphere. I tried to find my cadence again. "As you can see," I said, my voice sounding thinner than before, "the amygdala response is heightened in the second quadrant." But the rhythm was off. I could feel her watching me. It wasn't the respectful attention of a colleague. It was the focused observation of a predator, or perhaps a lover. The heat crawled up my neck, a physiological betrayal I hadn't authorized. I wrapped up the data dump quickly, needing to regain the upper hand. "Questions?" I asked, turning to the table. I expected the usual timid inquiries about dosage or recovery times. The residents shifted, silent, terrified of asking something stupid. Then she spoke. Her voice was low, a rich, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "You've mapped the electrical storm, Dr. Stone," she said, leaning back in her chair, a faint, challenging smile playing on her lips. "But you haven't accounted for the weather." The residents blinked, confused. I stared at her, my grip tightening on the laser pointer. "Excuse me?" I asked, my tone icy. "The patient," she continued, her eyes dark and amused. "You're treating the seizure as a mechanical failure, a wiring issue. But looking at this map, the firing patterns suggest emotional recall. You're fixing the structure, but ignoring the feeling. You can't diagnose the house fire if you ignore the arsonist." It was a duel. She wasn't just challenging my data, she was challenging my detachment, the very foundation of my career. The air thickened, coiled tight between us. She was asking me to look at the messiness of human emotion, the one thing I had spent a decade excising from my practice. My smartwatch buzzed against my wrist, a sharp, frantic vibration. I glanced down. High heart rate alert, 110 beats per minute. I was standing perfectly still, presenting a PowerPoint, but my body thought I was running for my life, or running towards something else. I looked up, and she was watching me check the watch. She knew. She saw the flush rising on my skin, the slight tremor in my hand that I quickly hid behind the podium. Her gaze held mine, unflinching, stripping away the title and the white coat until I felt exposed, raw. I couldn't breathe in there anymore. The walls of the conference room, usually my sanctuary, felt like they were closing in, pressing against my ribs. I needed to reset the variables. I needed distance. "We'll pick this up later," I said, my voice sharp, too loud in the quiet room. I snapped the laptop shut, severing the connection to the screen, and walked out before anyone could see that the architect of order was shaking. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, sealing the conference room's pressurized atmosphere away. But the silence of the corridor offered no relief. It was a different kind of vacuum out here. A long, sterile stretch of linoleum and fluorescent hum that usually calmed my nervous system. Today, it felt like a runway I was failing to clear. I walked fast, my heels striking the floor with a sharp, staccato rhythm that betrayed my urgency. I needed to get to the elevators. I needed vertical distance. I needed to be anywhere but on the same floor as the woman who had just dismantled my authority with a single sentence about the weather. I pressed the call button, the plastic cool against my damp fingertip. I pressed it again, harder, as if force could summon the car faster. That's when I heard it. The door down the hall opening. Not the heavy push of a resident, but that same deliberate, quiet click. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The sound of her footsteps was distinct, slower than mine, heavier, striking the ground with a cadence that suggested she had all the time in the world. She wasn't chasing me. That would have been easier to handle. I knew how to deal with aggression. She was simply following, pulling on an invisible tether I hadn't realized was attached to my waist. Dr. Stone. Her voice didn't echo. It wrapped around me, low and textured, sliding under the high-frequency hum of the hospital lights. I watched my own reflection in the brushed steel of the elevator doors, a blur of white coat and tension. I saw her reflection join mine, standing just over my shoulder, a dark, blurred shape that seemed to absorb the light around her. I spun around, my back hitting the cool metal of the door. "Dr. Rossi," I said, my voice clipped, clinging to the armor of professional courtesy. "I don't have time for a post-mortem on the presentation. If you have questions about the data, email my office." "I'm not interested in the data," she said. She took a step closer. The corridor was wide enough for a gurney, but she made it feel like a confessional booth. "I'm interested in why you're running." "I have rounds," I lied. The lie tasted like ash. "And I don't run." "You're vibrating, Stella." She used my first name like she had a permit for it. It wasn't an insult, it was a diagnosis. She tilted her head, her gaze, intelligent and terrifyingly amused, tracking the pulse I knew was visible in the hollow of my throat. "I can hear your heart from here." "That is physically impossible," I snapped, crossing my arms to hide the tremor in my hands. "And entirely inappropriate. We maintain boundaries in this department." "Boundaries," she repeated, testing the word. She took another step. "Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a dam holding back a flood." She was close enough now that I could see the flecks of gold in her irises, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her body. It wasn't aggressive, it was gravitational. My back was pressed against the elevator doors, and I had nowhere to go. I should have pushed past her. I should have reprimanded her. Instead, I froze. My brain, usually a supercomputer of responses and protocols, had crashed. Elena leaned in. She tracked the line of my mouth, then flicked her attention back to my eyes. A slow, deliberate path that felt like a physical touch. She lowered her voice, dropping it an octave until it was a murmur meant only for the space between our faces. "You're good at this," she whispered, her breath ghosting against my jaw. "The Ice Queen routine, the white coat, the command. It's very convincing." She paused, and her smile shifted, becoming something softer, something that hinted at a secret kept in the dark. "But it doesn't work on me. Because you don't remember the truth you told me that night." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. That night. The phrase triggered a violent, vertigo-inducing spin in my mind. I searched the archives, faces, conferences, bars, airports. Nothing. Just a blank, static wall where her face should be. "I don't know you," I managed to say, but my voice lacked all conviction. It was a plea, not a fact. "You're mistaken." "Am I?" She didn't back down. She just watched the shiver that started at the base of my spine and worked its way up. The elevator chimed, a loud, jarring bell that shattered the moment. The doors slid open behind me, offering escape. I stumbled backward into the car, breaking the magnetic field. Elena didn't follow. She just stood there in the hallway, hands in her pockets, watching me retreat with that knowing, devastating smile. The doors closed, cutting off her face, but the doubt she'd planted was already taking root, growing fast in the dark. My office was designed to be a vacuum. Soundproofed walls, mahogany desk, heavy glass. It was a containment unit for high-level cognition. Usually, the silence here was a relief, a blank slate where I could arrange complex problems into neat, solvable rows. But as the door clicked shut behind me, the silence felt different. It felt like the breathless quiet before a structural collapse. I moved behind my desk, not sitting, just gripping the edge of the leather chair. The containment was compromised. The air still felt displaced from where I had run, the adrenaline from the elevator encounter refusing to metabolize. I stared at the wall of framed degrees, the external hard drive of my competence. I was a neurologist. I understood the architecture of memory better than anyone in this building. I knew how the hippocampus encoded experience, how the cortex stored it, how the amygdala tagged it with emotional weight. My memory was a vault. I could recall the exact dosage of phenobarbital I prescribed to my first patient in residency. I could recite the tie color of the dean who handed me my diploma. I sat down, forcing my breathing to even out, and initiated the search command. Chicago, 3 years ago. The National Neurology Association Gala. The file was there, but it was corrupted. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingertips into my temples, trying to bypass the error message. I found the sensory data first. The Palmer House Hotel, the oppressive humidity of the ballroom, the drone of 1,000 voices begging for grant money. I remembered the escape. I remembered pushing through the heavy velvet curtains into the hotel bar, seeking darkness and whiskey. The taste hit me first. Peat and smoke, sharp on the tongue. I remembered the weight of the glass. I remembered the relief of slumping into a leather booth, hidden from the colleagues who wanted to discuss neuroplasticity at midnight. And then, the shadow. There was someone else in the booth. I could see the outline in my mind's eye, a shoulder turned toward me, the curve of a glass held in a hand that looked strong, capable. I could hear the voice, low and teasing, cutting through the ambient jazz. "You look like you're plotting a murder, or a nap." I remembered the laugh that followed, a warm sound that made the knot in my chest loosen. But when I tried to turn my head in the memory, when I tried to look at the face, the feed cut out. It was just static, a gray smear where her features should be. Why had my brain redacted her? We repress trauma, pain, fear. We don't repress whatever that was. That feeling of safety, that feeling of being anchored. I opened my eyes, frustrated, and looked down at my hands resting on the blotter. My right hand, my surgical hand, the hand that had clipped aneurysms and resected tumors without a microscopic deviation for a decade, was vibrating. A fine, high-frequency tremor rippled through my fingers. I stared at it with clinical horror. I didn't shake. I was the woman who threaded catheters through arteries, but there it was, a visceral failure. My body was remembering something my mind had deleted, and it was terrified. The sharp rap on my office door sounded like a gunshot. I snatched my hands off the desk, clasping them tightly in my lap to hide the weakness. "Come in," I said, my voice sounding strained, too high. The door opened. It wasn't a nurse. It wasn't a resident. Elena walked in, and the room shrank instantly. She had shed her wet coat, revealing a charcoal blouse that softened the line of her shoulders, but did nothing to dampen the intensity of her presence. She held a patient file, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at me. She walked to the desk, her movements predatory and graceful, and placed the file on the glass between us. "Consult," she said. One word. It hung in the air, heavy with double meaning. "I have a schedule, Dr. Rossi," I said, fighting to keep my voice flat. You can't just walk in. Patient in 402, she continued, ignoring my protest. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the edge of my desk, invading my territory. Complex partial seizures. Your resident recommends surgery. I think it's premature. If the focus is clear, resection is the standard of care, I recited, the protocol a shield. Standard of care isn't always the right care, she countered, her voice dropping that octave again, vibrating in the glass of the desk. Sometimes the scan doesn't show the whole story. Sometimes you have to wait for the storm to clear to see what's really damaged. You of all people should know that, Stella. You can't cut out what you refuse to see. She wasn't talking about the patient. The subtext was so loud, it was deafening. She was talking about the memory, about the tremor she knew I was hiding in my lap. Show me, I said, standing up abruptly. The proximity was too much, but I couldn't back down. Show me what you think I missed. Radiology Viewing Room 3 was less a medical facility and more a submarine. It was a windowless, soundproofed box tucked deep in the hospital's basement, illuminated only by the spectral blue glow of high-resolution monitors. The air here was recycled and cool, humming with the low-frequency vibration of cooling fans and hard drives. It was a place designed for isolation, for the solitary contemplation of gray matter and bone. It was the last place on Earth I should have brought Elena Rossi. I swiped my badge, and the magnetic lock disengaged with a heavy thud. I held the door open, gesturing for her to enter. She stepped past me, and in the confined space of the doorway, the air shifted. A sharp, electric freshness instantly overpowered the sterile smell of ionized air. I felt the heat of her body radiate against my front, a sudden, shocking warmth in the temperature-controlled chill. I held my breath until she moved further into the room, her silhouette cut sharp against the glowing screens. "Pull up the scan," she said, her voice soft, stripped of the challenge she'd wielded in the corridor. Here, in the dark, her tone was intimate, almost conspiratorial. I sat at the console, my fingers flying across the keyboard to summon the images. The MRI slices of the patient in 402 populated the screens, cross-sections of a human brain rendered in high-contrast grayscale. I focused on the temporal lobe, the area of the suspected seizure focus. It was a safe target. It was data. "Here," I said, pointing to the screen with a pen, refusing to use my hand. The focal dysplasia is evident in the mesial temporal region. It's structural. We cut it out, the seizures stop. It's a simple equation. Elena didn't sit in the spare chair. She leaned over my shoulder, bracing one hand on the back of my seat and the other on the desk, effectively boxing me in. She was looming, her face inches from mine, her eyes scanning the images, not with clinical detachment, but with a kind of reverence. "You're looking at the scar tissue," she murmured, her breath ghosting against my ear, sending a cascade of goosebumps down my neck that I prayed she couldn't see in the dim light. "Look at the limbic system, Stella. Look at the pathway." She reached out, her hand bypassing my pen. Her index finger traced a line on the screen, glowing blue in the monitor's light. As she moved, her forearm brushed against my shoulder. It was a glancing touch, barely contact, yet my nerves fired as if I'd touched a live wire. I went rigid, staring at the screen, unable to look at her. "The amygdala is hyperactive," she said, her finger tapping a cluster of white pixels. "And here, the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure center. It's lighting up like a Christmas tree." "That's likely artifact," I said, my voice tight. "Or stress response." "Is it?" She shifted her weight, leaning closer. Her hair, drying now into soft waves, fell forward, brushing against my cheek. It was an unbearable intimacy. "It looks like desire to me. Uncontrolled, chaotic firing. The brain wants what it wants, even if the conscious mind is trying to shut it down." She wasn't talking about the patient. We both knew it. The subtext was a roaring current beneath the surface of the conversation. She was diagnosing the tension in the room, using the language of my profession to dismantle my defenses. "Neurologically speaking," I managed to say, clinging to the science like a life raft, "uncontrolled firing leads to a crash. It burns out the system. That's why we regulate it. That's why we inhibit the signal. Inhibition causes atrophy," she countered smoothly. She turned her head, ignoring the screen to study my profile. I could feel the weight of her attention on my skin, heavier than the lead apron used in X-ray. If you suppress a pathway long enough, the brain forgets how to use it. Is that what happened to you, Stella? Did you inhibit the signal so hard you wiped the drive? I spun my chair to face her, a defensive reflex. It was a mistake. She was right there. Her face was illuminated by the blue light, casting deep shadows that made her eyes look endless. Her lips were parted slightly, and I remembered, suddenly violently, the taste of whiskey. I don't have gaps, I whispered, the lie crumbling even as I spoke it. You do, she said, her voice dropping to a husky murmur. She reached out, her hand hovering near my face, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of her palm. You have a massive void where that night should be, and it terrifies you. You're the master of the grid, the keeper of the keys. But there's a door you can't open. A flush of heat climbed up my neck, a physiological betrayal that had nothing to do with the room temperature and everything to do with the way she was looking at my mouth. I'm not afraid of anything, I said. Elena smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips that made my stomach drop. You're afraid of the dark, Stella. You're afraid of what happens when you turn off the lights and stop controlling the variables. You're afraid that if you remember how it felt to let go, you'll never want to grab the reins again. She leaned in, closing the final inch. The air between us was electric, charged with 3 years of silence and a storm of repressed memory. I should have pushed her away. I should have cited HR policy. Instead, my breath hitched and my eyes fluttered shut, waiting for the impact. Beep, beep, beep. The sound was shrill, ugly, and immediate. My pager, clipped to my waist, vibrated violently against my hip. The spell shattered. I gasped, eyes snapping open, pulling back as if I'd been burned. Elena didn't flinch, but she straightened up, the intense focus in her eyes cooling into a mask of professional patience. I grabbed the pager, my hands shaking. Code blue, I said, my voice sounding foreign. ICU, go, she said simply. I fled the room, but as the door clicked shut, I knew the diagnosis was confirmed. The signal wasn't inhibited anymore. It was screaming. The code blue in the ICU had been a successful resuscitation, a messy, chaotic victory of pharmacology over death. It was the kind of high-stakes adrenaline spike that usually left me feeling clear, sharpened to a fine point. But today, as I walked into the doctor's lounge 3 hours later, the clarity wouldn't come. The static from the radiology room was still humming in my ears, a persistent white noise that drowned out the usual satisfaction of saving a life. I needed caffeine. I needed the bitter, familiar grounding of terrible hospital coffee to reset my baseline and force my brain back into its rigid, predictable grid. The lounge was quiet, settling into the mid-afternoon lull where the sunlight slanted harshly through the blinds, illuminating the dust motes and the worn fabric of the sofas. It was a mundane space, a sanctuary of plastic trays and humming vending machines, a place for reheating lasagna and complaining about insurance authorizations. It was safe. Or it should have been. I saw her immediately. Elena was sitting in the corner armchair, legs crossed, a heavy medical text open on her lap. She wasn't reading. She was looking out the window at the gathering clouds, a ceramic mug cradled in her hands. She looked infuriatingly peaceful, possessing a stillness that made my own internal vibration feel violent by comparison. I turned toward the coffee machine, intending to ignore her, to grab my fuel and retreat to the safety of my office. Then, the air shifted. It wasn't coffee. A complex, dark aroma of cardamom, star anise, and black tea drifted across the room, riding the ventilation currents. It was distinct, heavy, and completely out of place in a room that usually stank of bleach and burnt popcorn. That specific blend hit my olfactory cortex and didn't just knock on the door of my memory, it kicked it down. There is no filter for smell. It bypasses the thalamus, the brain's relay station, and wires directly into the amygdala and the hippocampus. It is an immediate, unedited injection of the past. Logic didn't stand a chance against the chemistry of that tea. The hospital lounge dissolved. The fluorescent lights vanished. Suddenly, I was in the dark. The air was thick, heavy with humidity and the smell of expensive velvet. I was sitting on a plush leather banquette, sinking into it, my spine curving in a way I never allowed it to curve. There was a glass of amber liquid in front of me, whiskey, neat, and that same dark aroma hung in the heavy air, spiced tea and rain. "Drink," a voice said. It was low, amused, and dangerously close. I felt the memory not as an image, but as a visceral sensation on my skin. I felt the phantom weight of a hand settling on my knee. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was heavy, grounding, a claim of territory. In the memory, I didn't pull away. I didn't recoil. I leaned into it. "I'm so tired of deciding," I heard myself say. The voice in the memory sounded wrecked, stripped of all its polished armor. "I make 100 life-or-death decisions before noon. I want to stop." "Then stop," the voice murmured. The hand on my knee squeezed, a jolt of heat that traveled straight up my thigh. "Let me drive, Stella, just for tonight. You don't have to be the architect. You can just be the building." The surrender. That was the truth she had mentioned. It wasn't just that I had met her. I still couldn't see the face in the memory clearly. It was that I had given up. I had handed over the keys to the fortress. I had looked at a stranger in a bar and admitted that the control I worshipped was actually a cage. I gasped, the air rushing back into my lungs with a harsh sound. The lounge reassembled itself around me. The coffee machine hissed, signaling the end of its brew cycle. My hands were gripping the counter so hard my knuckles were white. I turned slowly. Elena was watching me. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. She lifted the mug to her lips, taking a slow sip. As she lowered it, her index finger traced the rim of the cup, a slow, deliberate circle. The gesture locked into place. I saw that finger tracing the rim of a whiskey glass in the dark. I saw the shape of the nail, the strength in the tendon of the wrist. The shadow in my memory finally had a hand. And that hand belonged to the woman sitting 10 feet away, drinking spiced tea as if she hadn't just detonated a bomb in my limbic system. It wasn't a neurological glitch. It wasn't a tumor. It was a repressed event. A night where I had stepped out of the role of Dr. Stone, chief of neurology, and into something far more vulnerable. And she had been there. She had held the weight I couldn't carry. The shame I expected to feel, the professional embarrassment of being undone, didn't come. Instead, a terrifying hunger seized me. I looked at her, really looked at her, and the static in my head cleared. I didn't want to run back to my office. I didn't want to hide behind a scan. I watched her trace the rim of the cup again, and my own skin burned with the memory of that touch. The diagnosis was complete. I couldn't treat this with medication. I couldn't excise it with a scalpel. The only way to fix the disruption was to reestablish the connection. I abandoned the coffee. I didn't need the caffeine anymore. I was wide awake. The memory didn't trickle in. It broke the dam. The sensory trigger of the spiced tea dissolved the hospital lounge completely, and suddenly, I was 3 years in the past. The sterile white walls of the break room were replaced by the opulent, suffocating gold leaf of the Palmer House Hilton in Chicago. It was the annual Neurology Association Gala, a black-tie purgatory where 500 of the country's brightest minds gathered to measure egos and beg for grant money. The air had been thick with the smell of expensive perfume and desperate ambition. I had been the keynote speaker that year, the rising star, the youngest department chief in the room. I had spent 4 hours smiling, shaking hands, and discussing neuroplasticity until my own synapses felt like they were snapping. I remembered the panic. It had started as a tight band across my chest, the crushing weight of expectation. Everyone wanted a piece of me. Everyone wanted the architect, the genius, the woman who never made a mistake. I couldn't breathe. I had slipped away during the salad course, moving through the service corridors like a fugitive, desperate for darkness. I found the hotel bar, not the main lobby lounge, but a small, dimly lit speakeasy tucked away in the back. It was a cave of crushed red velvet and shadows, smelling of old wood and secrets. I slid into the furthest booth, hidden by a heavy curtain, and ordered a double whiskey, neat. I wanted the burn. I wanted to numb the noise. Then the curtain moved. She didn't ask to join me. She didn't offer a polite preamble or check for a wedding ring. She simply slid into the booth opposite me, occupying the space with that same fluid, terrifying confidence she had displayed in my conference room today. In the dim amber light, she looked like a painting of a storm. Dark hair, an intense stare, and a mouth that seemed to know every lie I had ever told myself. She wasn't wearing a conference badge. She wasn't one of us. "You look like you're calculating the structural integrity of the ceiling," she said. Her voice was lower then, rougher, perhaps from the whiskey she was already nursing. "I'm not calculating," I replied, my voice sounding ragged to my own ears. "I'm praying for a collapse." She laughed, a low, rich sound that vibrated in the small space between us. "A bit dramatic for a doctor. Aren't you supposed to be saving lives?" "I'm off the clock," I said, taking a heavy swallow of the drink. The alcohol burned, a welcome, grounding wire. "And I'm tired of saving things. I'm tired of holding up the roof." That was the moment, the pivot point. I should have stopped. I should have put the Dr. Stone mask back on, offered a polite platitude, and left. But the anonymity of the bar, the darkness, and the way she was looking at me, like she could see the cracks in the foundation, loosened something deep in my chest. "It's heavy, isn't it?" she asked softly. She leaned forward, her forearms resting on the sticky wood of the table. "Being the one who knows everything? The one who decides who lives and who dies? The one who never shakes." "I hate it," I whispered. The confession tore out of me, violent and unplanned. It was the first time I had ever said it aloud. I hate the control. I hate that everyone looks at me for the answer. I make 100 life or death decisions before noon. I am so tired of deciding. I looked up at her, my eyes stinging. "I want to be ruined," I confessed, the words tasting like copper and ash. "I want to be overwhelmed. I want someone else to take the keys. I want to stop thinking." She didn't look away. She didn't offer pity or awkward reassurance. She reached across the table, and her hand covered mine. It wasn't a tentative comfort. It was a capture. Her palm was warm, her grip firm. She grounded me. "Then stop," she murmured. Her thumb stroked the pulse point of my wrist, sending a jolt of electricity straight to my core. "Let it fall, Stella. Give me the keys. I can handle your chaos. You don't have to be the architect tonight. You can just be the building." The intimacy of it was staggering. It wasn't sex, though the air was thick with it. It was something far more dangerous. It was permission to disintegrate. We sat there for hours, her hand on mine, her voice a low rumble in the dark, stripping away my defenses layer by layer until I was just a woman, raw and wanting. I drank her in. I let her lead. For one night, I didn't decide a single thing. The memory of the morning after cut through the reverence like a knife. I remembered waking up in her hotel room, the gray Chicago light filtering through the sheer curtains. I saw her sleeping form, the curve of her shoulder, the peace on her face, and I felt the panic rise, cold, sharp, and absolute. I had given too much. I had shown her the soft underbelly of the beast. I was Dr. Stella Stone. I didn't need anyone. I didn't surrender. I had fled. I dressed in silence, my hands shaking as I buttoned my blouse. I left without a note. I checked out of the hotel, changed my flight, and was back in New York by noon. I buried the memory under layers of work and ambition. I treated it like a corrupted file, deleting it from the server to protect the system. Back in the hospital lounge, the mug of cold coffee sat forgotten on the counter. The shame I had felt that morning in Chicago was gone, burned away by the heat of the memory. I stared at Elena's back, at the way her hair curled over her collar. I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt a desperate, starving need to reclaim the only moment in my life where I had been truly free. I wasn't running this time. By the time I reached the research wing, the sky outside had turned the color of a fresh bruise, deep purple and swollen with rain. The storm that had been threatening the city all afternoon finally broke, lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the connecting bridge with a violence that made the glass tremble. The hospital had shifted into its night rhythm. The frantic energy of the day shift had drained away, replaced by the low, steady hum of maintenance protocols and the skeleton crew. The corridors were dim, the overhead fluorescents powered down to their energy-saving half-brightness. It was a time I usually loved, a time when the building felt like a sleeping machine I was solely responsible for monitoring. But tonight, the quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the hush before an execution. I found her in the main neuroimaging lab. I knew she would be there. The schedule I had memorized but pretended to ignore listed her for a recalibration of the 7 Tesla MRI coils. The lab was a cavern of shadows and blinking LEDs. The main overhead lights were off, leaving the room illuminated only by the lightning stuttering through the windows and the soft, rhythmic pulse of the standby lights on the server banks. Elena was standing at the far workbench, her back to the door. She was bent over a disassembled head coil, a delicate mess of copper wiring and sensors. In the erratic light of the lightning, she looked like an alchemist working in a cave. I stopped in the doorway, watching her. The air pressure in the room was palpable, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. It was the drop before the thunder, the moment where the atmosphere becomes so heavy that breathing feels like a conscious, manual effort. She didn't turn around. She had to know I was there. The door to the lab was heavy, and the hydraulic hiss of it opening was distinct. But she kept working. Her hands moved with steady, deliberate grace, adjusting a microcircuit with a jeweler's screwdriver. She was waiting. She was letting me set the parameters of this interaction. She was letting me decide if I was going to be the chief of neurology or the woman from the bar. I stepped inside. The floor was anti-static rubber, absorbing the sound of my heels. But the silence between us was so loud I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I didn't walk to the bench. Instead, I turned back to the door. I reached out, my fingers stiff with the adrenaline of the cliff edge, and turned the deadbolt. Click! The sound was small, mechanical, and final. It echoed in the vast, machine-filled room. It was a violation of every safety protocol I enforced. Never lock a lab door from the inside. Never isolate yourself in a high-voltage area. But I wasn't interested in safety. I was locking the world out. I was sealing the vessel so the reaction could finally happen. Helena's hands stopped moving. She didn't straighten up, didn't turn, but the stillness that overtook her was absolute. She placed the screwdriver down on the anti-static mat with a soft tink. I took a breath. The room was heavy with charged ozone and the faint, lingering trace of cardamom that seemed to have followed her here. The memory of Chicago was no longer a fragmented glitch. It was a roaring fire in the center of my mind, illuminating everything I had kept in the dark for 3 years. It wasn't a mistake, I said. My voice was steady, stripped of the command voice I used for rounds. It was just me. And it wasn't a delusion. Elena remained facing the workbench, her shoulders tense under the charcoal fabric of her shirt. "Go on," she said, her voice low, blending with the rumble of thunder that rolled through the floorboards. I took a step toward her, drawn by a gravity I was done fighting. "I remember the curtain," I said, the words tumbling out, desperate to be spoken. "I remember the weight of the velvet. I remember that the bar smelled like dust and cedar." I swallowed, my throat dry. "It was the whiskey and the rain, and I told you I wanted to surrender." The admission hung in the air, more dangerous than any diagnosis I had ever delivered. I had stripped myself bare. I had admitted that the control I wielded like a weapon was actually a burden I was desperate to put down. Elena turned slowly. In the gloom, her face was a study in shadows. She wasn't smiling anymore. The teasing, playful edge she had worn in the conference room and the elevator was gone. In its place was something raw, something intense and unguarded. She looked at me not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a reality finally acknowledged. She leaned back against the lab bench, crossing her arms over her chest, her dark eyes locking onto mine with a force that pinned me to the spot. "You remembered," she said softly. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement of the shift in the universe. "I tried not to," I admitted, walking closer until the distance between us was a mere few feet of charged air. "I tried to delete it. I thought if I remembered how good it felt to let go, I would fall apart. I thought I would break." "You didn't break that night, Stella," Elena murmured. The lightning flashed again, illuminating the gold flecks in her eyes. "You opened. There's a difference." "I'm afraid," I whispered. The confession was the final lock turning. "Good," Elena said. She uncrossed her arms and pushed off the bench, taking one slow step toward me. "Fear means you're paying attention." "You waited," I breathed, the realization hitting me harder than the whiskey had 3 years ago. "You knew the moment you walked into the conference room. You saw the recognition in my body before my mind even processed it. Why didn't you say something? Why did you let me spin out?" "Because you're a scientist, Stella," Elena said. She took a step closer, her boots making a heavy, deliberate sound on the rubber floor. "You don't believe in miracles. You believe in data. If I had told you in the elevator that we shared a soul-bearing night in Chicago, you would have categorized me as a stalker or a liar. You would have filed a restraining order to protect your precious grid." She paused, glancing briefly at my lips before meeting my stare again. "I needed you to run the diagnostics yourself. I needed you to find the glitch." "I found it," I whispered. "It's not a glitch. It's a missing file." "And now that you've recovered it?" She moved then. It wasn't the predatory stalk of the conference room anymore. It was the gravitational pull of a collapsing star. I took a step back, my hip bumping against the stainless steel of the lab counter. There was nowhere left to go. The variable had filled the room. Elena didn't stop until she had caged me in, placing her hands on the counter on either side of me. The heat of her body was a shockwave, radiating through the thin fabric of my lab coat. "I didn't want to take advantage of the amnesia," she murmured, her voice rougher now, stripped of the playful veneer. "If I had kissed you in the elevator, you would have hated yourself for it. You would have called it a lapse in judgment, a momentary weakness. I needed you to know exactly who you were letting in. I needed you to remember that you asked for this." "I know who you are," I said, my voice barely audible over the hum of the servers. "You're the disruption." "I'm the baseline," she countered. Her hands moved from the cold steel of the counter to my waist. The contact was heavy, firm, possessive. It was the same touch from the bar, the same grounding force that had anchored me 3 years ago. The tremor in my hands, the one I had been hiding in my pockets all day, stopped instantly. It was a physiological miracle. The moment she took hold, the vibration ceased. My cerebellum realized it didn't have to maintain the balance anymore. She was doing it for me. The relief was so profound it made my knees weak. "Tell me what you want, Stella," she demanded softly, her thumbs pressing into the curve of my hip bone. "I don't want to lead," I confessed, the words tearing out of my throat, raw and honest. "I don't want to be the chief. I don't want to be the genius. I just want to surrender," she finished for me. "Yes." Elena's grip tightened. She leaned in, tilting her head, erasing the last fraction of distance. "Then let go." The kiss wasn't tentative. It was an impact event. It was 3 years of repressed data exploding in a single millisecond. It was a collision of intellect and instinct, a violent reintegration of the parts of myself I had tried to keep separate. Her mouth was hot, demanding, tasting of that spiced tea and the electric charge of the storm. I gasped into it, my hands clutching the lapels of her lab coat, pulling her closer, trying to fuse our timelines back together. The chief of neurology didn't exist in this space. There were no protocols here, no sterile fields. There was only the friction of her body against mine, the rough glide of her tongue, the desperate, clawing need to be consumed. My brain, usually a frantic processor of 1,000 streams of information, went silent. The noise stopped. The expectations vanished. There was only this: the heat, the taste, the anchor. I felt myself melting, physically slumping against the hard edge of the counter, my legs refusing to hold my weight. Elena caught me. She pressed her thigh between mine, holding me up, taking the weight I had been carrying for a decade. She made a low sound in her throat, a growl of satisfaction that vibrated against my lips, and I answered it with a whimper that would have horrified my residents. "I've got you," she whispered against my mouth, her hands sliding up to tangle in my hair, tilting my head back to deepen the angle. "I have the controls, Stella. You can sleep now." It was the most terrifying and beautiful thing anyone had ever said to me. I stopped thinking. I stopped analyzing. I simply felt. Thunder rattled the panes one last time, a final crescendo that shook the walls, and then, as if acknowledging the shift in power, the downpour began to slow. The tension in the room broke, replaced by a heavy, humid silence, punctuated only by the ragged sound of our breathing. The silence in the lab settled around us like a heavy, warm blanket. It wasn't the sterile, pressurized silence of the operating theater, nor the lonely quiet of my office. It was a shared thing, thick with the aftermath of the storm, both the one outside and the one we had just weathered against the stainless steel counter. We didn't spring apart with the guilt of teenagers caught in the dark. The separation was slow, a reluctant untangling of limbs and breath. I stayed leaning against the counter, my legs still feeling like water, watching Elena step back into her own space. She reached up to smooth her hair, a simple human gesture that felt incredibly intimate to witness. My own hands found the lapels of my white coat. It was wrinkled, the pristine armor compromised. 3 hours ago, that crease would have been a crisis. Now, looking at the fabric that had been crushed between our bodies, it just looked like evidence. I didn't try to flatten it. "Well," I said, my voice sounding husky, a stranger's rasp in the quiet room. "That creates a variable." Elena chuckled, a low, warm sound that wrapped around my spine. She leaned against the workbench opposite me, crossing her ankles. She didn't look worried. She looked like she had just successfully calibrated the most complex machine in the building. "Variables are only a problem if you don't know how to integrate them, Stella. I think we have plenty of data now." "Working together," I started, the chief of neurology trying to reassert herself, trying to pull up the HR handbook in my mind. "It's going to be complicated. The hierarchy, the department politics." "We'll manage the politics," she interrupted softly, cutting through the anxiety before it could take root. "You're the architect, remember? You can redesign the structure." She was right. The panic that had sent me fleeing from Chicago wasn't there. The shame was gone. In its place was a steady, quiet hum of capability. I wasn't afraid of the complication. I was actually looking forward to solving it. It felt like diagnosing a complex case where the solution required breaking the rules. Elena pushed off the bench and walked over to me. She didn't touch me this time, not with her hands. She just stood close enough that I could feel her warmth, invading my personal space in a way that no longer felt like an invasion, but like a necessary condition for life. She leaned in, her voice a whisper that brushed against my cheek. "You told me the truth that night," she murmured, validating the memory one last time, sealing the fissure. "And tonight, you lived it. You don't have to carry the roof alone anymore." I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 3 years. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay," she echoed. We left the lab together. I didn't check the lock. I didn't scan the hallway for witnesses. We walked down the long, sterile corridor side by side. The fluorescent lights were still humming their aggressive white noise, but the sound didn't grate on my nerves anymore. The hospital was just a building again. It wasn't a fortress I had to defend. It was just a place where I worked. I walked with a looser gait, my hands swinging freely at my sides, no longer clenched in pockets. As we passed under a flickering light, the back of her hand brushed against mine. I didn't pull away. I let the contact linger, a secret current running between us, grounding me to the earth. The elevator doors slid open with a chime that sounded like an invitation. We stepped inside. As the heavy doors began to close, I caught my reflection in the brushed metal. My hair was loose, my lips swollen, my armor unbuttoned. I looked completely undone. And for the first time, I loved it. The doors clicked shut. If you've ever found freedom in losing control, subscribe to see where the story goes next.